At precisely 6:42 each morning, the bell above the door of Millie's diner gave its familiar jingle, a small, silvery sound that seemed to pause the world for just a breath. It was always 6:42. Not a minute earlier, never a second too late. That was when Hal Mercer stepped through the door, the cold air trailing in behind him like a ghost from another century. He wasn't a man who demanded attention. In fact, he seemed to shrink from it. His presence was quiet, deliberate, like a man who'd spent years learning how not to disturb the air around him. He wore a heavy olive coat, the kind that looked like it had stories stitched into its seams, frayed at the cuffs, buttons mismatched, and on the left breast, faded almost to nothing, was a patch, a dull, triangular insignia with colors too worn to read. The regulars noticed him, of course. You couldn't come in every day at the exact same time and not be noticed. But Hal had long since become a fixture of the place, like the ancient jukebox that hadn't worked since '97 or the dent in the linoleum floor by booth 3. He belonged there, in a way no one questioned. He always sat at the same table by the window. Not because of the view, there was none, but because the light hit just right. Forgiving. The waitress, Darlene, had long since stopped offering him a menu. She knew what he wanted. Black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, rye toast with just a whisper of butter. No talk, no fuss. And Hal never brought a book, or a phone, or even a paper. He just sat there, hands wrapped around the warm ceramic cup, eyes distant, like he was watching a film only he could see. Sometimes his fingers would twitch, subtle, involuntary movements that betrayed the calmness of his face. Once, Darlene caught him flinching when a kid knocked over a salt shaker. The glass shattered, sharp and sudden, and Hal had jerked as though he were bracing for shrapnel. But then he'd just smiled, faintly, like he was apologizing to no one in particular. No one in town really knew where he lived. He wasn't from here, that much was obvious. He didn't speak of family, never mentioned a wife or children. And while some folks might have wondered, the kind of wondering that brews gossip, Hal's silence carried a certain weight that made you feel intrusive just thinking about it. Still, every so often, a stranger would pass through and glance twice at him. Veterans mostly. Older men who seemed suddenly sober when their eyes met Hal's. They wouldn't speak, not directly, but there was a look, a momentary flicker of recognition. Like they knew something, or remembered something they wished they didn't. One winter morning, as the snow piled quietly outside and the diner steamed with the scent of bacon and burnt coffee, a teenage boy named Eddie asked Darlene, "Hey, who is that guy anyway?" "That old man with the military coat." Darlene didn't look up from refilling a sugar shaker. She just said softly, "That's Hal Mercer. He's seen more than he'll ever tell you. And he's done more than most men brag about." Eddie rolled his eyes and muttered something about crazy old vets, but Darlene's eyes narrowed. Not in anger, but with something like reverence. "There are men," she said, wiping the counter slowly, "who wear their pride on their sleeves. And then there are men like Hal, who carry their ghosts in silence." From his table, Hal took another sip of his coffee. Outside, the wind moaned against the glass, and for just a moment, the steam from his cup curled like smoke rising from something long extinguished. Whatever Hal Mercer had done, he was not yet finished paying for it. And in the quiet rhythms of the diner, in the ritual of mornings that came and went like the tide, he seemed to be waiting, not for redemption perhaps, but for remembrance. If Hal Mercer was the whisper in a crowded room, Brandon Hale was the thunderclap. Where Hal moved through the world with the careful deliberation of a man afraid of waking something inside himself, Brandon stormed through it, unapologetically alive. He arrived in town one late autumn afternoon, just as the leaves had begun their descent into brittle fire, the same way everything beautiful seems to fall, without permission and all at once. He drove a midnight blue Jaguar, sleek and humming with power, the kind of car that didn't belong on cracked rural roads but demanded them to rise to its level. When he stepped out, dressed in a crisp wool coat, leather gloves folded in one hand, sunglasses even though the clouds hung low and heavy, he might as well have been carved from some different material than the rest of them. Less bone, more ambition. He didn't walk into Millie's diner so much as glide. And the moment he entered, something shifted, not just in the air, but in the posture of those inside. Conversation paused. Forks lingered mid-air. Even Darlene blinked once, as though registering a different frequency. Brandon Hale was charm-wrapped in a tailored suit. He had the kind of smile that could sell a lie and make you feel privileged to believe it. He greeted everyone with names he shouldn't have known and familiarity that was too polished to be real. When he saw Hal, who, as always, sat alone by the window, his smile faltered, just slightly, like a ripple breaking across still water. "Hal Mercer," Brandon said, his voice rich, almost affectionate. "I'll be damned." Hal didn't look up immediately. When he did, it was with the kind of slow, weighted glance a man gives a memory he didn't ask to see again. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither spoke. The diner felt smaller, colder. Darlene, who'd never seen Hal speak more than a few words, suddenly felt the urge to clear the plates, as if something important might spill. Brandon pulled out a chair across from Hal without asking. "Been a long time," he said, like they were old friends catching up. But there was tension beneath the words. A rehearsed casualness. Hal didn't respond. His silence wasn't defensive. It was judgment in its purest form. Quiet, unyielding, and impossibly loud. Where Hal carried his past like a wound too deep to heal, Brandon wore his like a medal, polished and gleaming. He spoke of cities and contracts, of meetings in glass towers and art galleries in Prague. He painted a picture of a man unburdened, a man who had won. And yet, sitting across from Hal, his voice occasionally wavered, like a string pulled too tight. "Still here?" Brandon asked at one point, with a chuckle that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Same town, same table, same old coffee." Hal stared at him, then at the window. "Some of us stay where the truth last looked us in the eye," he said. The words weren't cruel, just honest, heavy enough to make Brandon lean back slightly, like the weight had suddenly shifted. What neither man said was more revealing than what they did. They had been comrades once, brothers in action, in dirt and fear and orders shouted under gunfire. But something had broken between them. Not all wounds bleed. Some rot slowly in the quiet spaces of conscience. Brandon rose after only 10 minutes. He adjusted his coat, flashed that same dazzling smile to the room, and left a business card on the table. "If you ever want something more than this," he said, glancing around the diner like it was a cage, "give me a call." Hal didn't touch the card. He didn't watch him leave. He simply looked back out the window, where the sun was setting in bands of bruised purple and gold, and in his stillness there was something deeper than bitterness. There was grief, not for what had happened, but for what they had become. Brandon's Jaguar roared to life outside, breaking the calm, and Hal, staring past the horizon, whispered a name no one else could hear, one that neither he nor Brandon had dared speak aloud that day. Because some ghosts wear a suit and smile when they return. And some men, like Hal Mercer, live with the knowledge that silence is the only voice truth ever trusted. The town park wasn't much. A modest patch of green bordered by sycamores and tired benches, framed on one side by a rusting swing set and on the other by a duck pond that looked more like a murky mirror on overcast days. Most people passed through it without thinking. Parents with strollers, retirees walking dogs, teenagers carving hearts into tree trunks. It was a place that held no particular importance. But for Hal Mercer, it was the only ground that didn't shift beneath his feet. He worked there 6 days a week. Not officially, not for pay. He'd never filled out a form or signed a name. He simply showed up, tools in hand, gloves on. And he got to work before the sun had the courage to rise. The town council once considered hiring a maintenance crew, but the matter always ended in quiet murmurs. "Well, Hal takes care of it, doesn't he?" And so he became the unofficial caretaker of the park, the man who asked for nothing and gave it everything. Each morning he swept the paths, cleared the leaves, straightened the benches, painted over graffiti with an almost monastic focus. He repaired broken boards on the footbridge with hands that still trembled some days, not from age, but from something older, something deeper. He planted flowers in the spring, the kind that didn't demand too much of the soil. He trimmed branches in the fall with careful hands, as if the trees might feel pain if he wasn't gentle enough. It wasn't the work itself that mattered. It was the ritual, the simplicity, the clarity of cause and effect. Here, unlike the world he'd left behind, action had consequence. Effort meant something. A broken swing could be fixed. A dead tree replaced. There were no moral compromises in weeds or rust or rot. Only the quiet certainty that he was doing something good, however small. Children played on the jungle gym he'd reinforced himself. Old men played chess on tables he'd sanded smooth. Young lovers carved initials into the bark of trees Hal had wrapped with burlap in the winter to protect them from frost. They didn't know it was him. Most never asked. He preferred it that way. Recognition felt like spotlight, and Hal had spent a lifetime in shadows by choice. Yet there was one boy, Nathan, maybe 8 years old, who came to the park each Tuesday afternoon with his grandmother. Nathan noticed Hal. Noticed the way he moved, slow but deliberate, always watching, always fixing. The boy would wave sometimes, and Hal would give the smallest nod in return, an unspoken contract of acknowledgement between quiet souls. One day Nathan approached him. "Are you the park man?" he asked, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. Hal paused, a trowel in one hand, the other resting on a weathered knee. He looked at the boy and, after a moment, nodded. "Something like that. Why do you do it?" Nathan asked. Hal looked past him then, toward the pond, where a pair of ducks circled each other in slow, serene loops. He didn't answer right away. How could he explain it? That in this park he could fix what was broken. That here, every act of care felt like redemption, however small. That guilt, like a weed, grew wild in the mind, and tending to the earth was the only way he'd found to slow it down. "I like when things are taken care of," Hal said finally. "It makes the world feel a little less lost." Nathan didn't really understand, but he nodded, as kids do when they sense something serious in the air, something meant to be respected even if not fully grasped. As the boy ran off to chase pigeons, Hal returned to his work. He knelt beside a flower bed, pulling out crabgrass, one root at a time. Each one came with resistance. But he was used to that. Pain, after all, was just another kind of memory. In the center of the park, there was a small plaque on a stone pedestal. Most had forgotten who it honored. Hal hadn't. He had placed it there himself years ago, when no one was looking. The name etched into the granite had faded from public memory, but Hal traced it with his fingers each evening before he left. Name. Life. A debt unpaid. Some days, especially when the sky was heavy and the air smelled like rain, Hal would sit on the bench nearest the plaque and close his eyes. And in the hush of leaves brushing against each other, in the distant laughter of children unaware of the world's weight, he would allow himself a single breath of peace. Not forgiveness. That was too grand, too far. Just peace. A fleeting stillness in the war he carried inside. The letter came folded inside a plain white envelope with no return address, only his name in a precise, almost military hand. Hal stared at it for a long time before opening it, as if he could delay whatever gravity it carried simply by holding it at arm's length. But the weight was already in him. He knew before he even read the first line that this wasn't a letter. It was a summons. The message was simple. Name. Time. Place. General Marcus F. Langley. Retired. Saturday. 3 p.m. The Edgewood Veterans Hall. Room 204. Hal had not heard Langley's name in over a decade. Not since the court-martial, the classified debriefings, the transfer orders. Not since that day in the jungle when silence had been chosen over truth. He remembered Langley's voice, low and calm, a man whose every word carried the weight of command and calculation. He remembered the cold eyes that had seen too much to care, the way he lit a cigarette just before telling men they would not be coming back from their next mission. He arrived at the hall 15 minutes early, because punctuality was the last shred of discipline he hadn't allowed to rust. The building was quiet, humming faintly with the tired buzz of fluorescent lights. Room 204 smelled like old paper, metal, and something buried beneath, a faint tang of history left to settle in the walls. Langley was already there, seated behind a desk with nothing on it. He looked older, the sharp lines of his face now etched deeper, hair gone to silver, though his posture remained impeccable. He didn't rise when Hal entered, only gestured to the empty chair across from him, as if this were just another debriefing, not a confrontation 15 years in the making. "Mercer," Langley said. Not unkindly, not warmly, just factually, like the name was a checkbox on a report. Hal sat. His back was straight, his hands folded. He said nothing. "I imagine you've wondered why," Langley began. "Why everything unfolded the way it did. Why Brandon walked away a hero. Why you walked away with nothing." Hal didn't flinch. "I stopped wondering. It rotted too much." Langley studied him. "But you never left it behind. You don't leave behind the men who didn't come home." Beep. Then Langley exhaled, soft, controlled. "There's a reason you're here today. I'm dying, Mercer. Liver. Months, if that. I'm not asking for pity. I've had more time than I deserved. But I don't intend to take all my ghosts with me." He opened a drawer and placed a folder on the table. Its edges were frayed, the corners curled. Hal recognized the insignia stamped on the cover. "Classified. Red level." "You remember Operation Alabaster," Langley said. Hal's jaw tightened. "I remember burying things that shouldn't have been buried." Langley nodded. "So do I. But I didn't bury them alone." He opened the folder. Inside were photographs. Grainy black and white stills of jungle terrain, aerial scans, personnel reports. But the last page was what mattered. A transcript. Confession. A name. Brandon Hale. In bold ink, beneath a summary of actions that, had they ever surfaced, would have dismantled every honor he wore on his chest. "He cut the deal before the extraction," Langley said. "Sold coordinates. In exchange for immunity and advancement. Your unit was the collateral. You weren't meant to walk out alive." Hal stared at the paper, his breath still. "And you let it happen." Langley didn't deny it. "I authorized the silence. I saw the bigger picture. Intel recovery, diplomatic leverage, future contracts. Brandon was useful." "You sacrificed 10 men," Hal said, voice low but sharp. "You let me carry their names. You let me wear the guilt." Langley looked at him now, and for the first time, something flickered behind the eyes. Regret, or the closest thing a man like him could feel to it. "You were the only one who wouldn't be bought. And the only one who might survive." Hal stood. He didn't need to hear more. The folder stayed on the table. He didn't want to carry it. He already carried enough. But as he reached the door, Langley spoke again, quieter now. "I called you because you deserved to know. Because silence is its own kind of cruelty." Hal didn't turn around. "It's not cruelty that haunts men like me, General. It's obedience." Then he left. Outside, the sky was bruised with evening. Clouds rolled in heavy and gray. Hal stood beneath them like a man returned from a war he never agreed to fight. The wind bit against his coat, and in his hands he felt nothing but tremor. Rage restrained, sorrow unspent. He walked without direction, as if the motion itself was a prayer. A way to bleed the past through the soles of his boots. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang. Perhaps from the chapel, perhaps from nothing at all. And in his silence, a decision began to take shape. He would no longer be the only one who remembered. Because sometimes the truth isn't what sets you free. It's what finally allows you to speak. Even if your voice shakes. Even if it comes too late for the dead to hear. The ceremony was small, quiet, held beneath the weeping branches of an old elm tree in the park Hal had tended for years. It wasn't a military funeral. No rifles fired, no folded flag. Just a handful of townspeople, a few veterans in weather jackets, and the boy Nathan, holding a single sunflower in his hands like it meant something enormous. Hal Mercer had passed without noise. No obituary in the paper. No family to speak for him. When he was found, tools still neatly arranged by the bench, gloves folded on top like hands in prayer, it was the park supervisor who alerted the town council. Word spread slowly, not like wildfire but like fog, creeping into the corners of people's lives until they paused long enough to feel it. No one had known much about him. They just knew he was there. Always. Reliable as sunrise. And then, suddenly, he wasn't. What remained of Hal fit into one cardboard box. A few shirts, some old medals buried beneath socks, a journal with only the first page filled. 6 words scrawled in a firm, slanted hand. "There are things I can't undo." And the folder. The one he had taken from Langley's desk. He hadn't destroyed it. He hadn't published it. Instead, in the final week of his life, Hal had mailed it to a reporter, a young woman from a regional paper who'd once interviewed him about the park. He must have sensed something in her. Integrity, maybe. Or just the willingness to listen. The story hit the press 3 days before the ceremony. Names were named. A scandal buried for 15 years erupted like rot under lifted stone. Brandon Hale was stripped of his honors. His reputation eviscerated. Langley's name sparked hearings in D.C., though he had already passed. Poisoned, some said, by the truths he'd confessed too late. But Hal wasn't there to see any of it. He hadn't stayed for the vindication. That wasn't what he wanted. He wanted the weight to shift. Just a little. As mourners trickled away from the elm tree, one by one, Nathan lingered. He knelt by the bench where Hal always sat, the one nearest the stone plaque. Someone had added new words beneath the original engraving. Hal Mercer, a man who tended more than just the earth. Nathan didn't fully understand what Hal had done, but he felt it. The park looked the same, but it breathed differently now. Like something sacred had passed through and left fingerprints in the soil. The flowers bloomed brighter. The path curved just a little smoother. A new bench had been placed beneath the elm tree, its brass plaque etched simply, "For the quiet ones who carry the heaviest loads." The townspeople began to speak of Hal in murmurs of reverence. Children called him the park guardian. Veterans left coins and dog tags at the foot of the bench. One man, who'd served and survived, visited every Sunday and whispered names aloud. And somewhere, deep in the hush of leaves and the laughter of children, something of Hal remained. Not his face, not his voice, but his mark, invisible but undeniable. A way of being, a kind of presence, the courage not to forget. And though Hal never asked for it, he was remembered, not as a hero in uniform, but as a man who stood when silence was easier, who chose truth not for glory but for peace, not for himself but for the dead. Because in the end, Hal Mercer was never trying to be remembered. He was just trying to make things right. And that, quietly, irrevocably, was exactly what he did. Began with a dream. Nathan had never dreamed of Hal before. Not while the man was alive, not during the slow weeks of grieving. But one night, as spring pressed its fingers gently against the windows, the boy saw him. Not as the quiet gardener sitting cross-legged in the soil, but standing in a foreign place lit by desert sun, eyes shadowed beneath a helmet. His mouth set in that same solemn line Nathan had only seen when Hal thought no one was looking. There were voices in the dream. Broken, fragmented. A scream buried in static. A name shouted then swallowed. And Hal turning, reaching for someone who never appeared. When Nathan awoke, the sun was already up, casting long beams across the wooden floor like the lines of some invisible story. He sat up, heart thudding, unsure if what he'd seen was memory or invention. But something had shifted, like the air had changed its weight. Days later, the boy returned to the park, drawn not by obligation, but by something more magnetic. An ache, a need to understand. He sat by Hal's bench with the worn folder the reporter had left behind. She had interviewed Nathan after the ceremony, pressing a gentle recorder into his hands, asking questions about Hal that Nathan couldn't answer. But she had left the folder saying simply, "He wanted someone who knew him to see it." Inside were photographs, most too blurred to identify. Others stark and brutal. A child's shoe beside a crater. A soldier's face, lips parted as if to speak before the photograph took his final breath. There were letters most unsent. One, unsigned, simply read. If they knew what we left behind, they wouldn't call us heroes. They'd call us haunted. Nathan read every word. Some he didn't understand. Some he understood too well. He realized Hal had carried more than truth. He had carried memory, like shards of broken glass pressed into the lining of his soul. And he had shielded those around him from their edges. That night the dreams returned. Not nightmares but echoes. Hal's voice this time. Softer. Telling a story Nathan had never heard. About a boy who didn't make it. About a decision made under fire. About orders that felt like betrayal dressed in duty. Nathan sat up in the dark, whispering into the silence. You did what you could. It was not forgiveness. Hal had never asked for that. But it was a bridge. Connection. A way to carry the memory forward, not as a burden, but as a truth worth honoring. Others, too, began to remember. The veteran who once visited weekly now spoke openly of Hal's time overseas. How he refused a medal that would have buried another man's mistake. How he filed complaints no one wanted to read. A woman from the town council admitted Hal had stopped her from bulldozing the garden where she now took her grandchildren every weekend. The reporter, weeks later, published a follow-up piece. Not about the scandal, but about the man. The gardener. The witness. The friend. And in the library, Nathan asked to read everything about the war Hal had served in. He read about politics and silence, about the machinery of forgetting. He read until the ink bled into his dreams. He did not want to be Hal, but he wanted to remember him rightly. Not just as the man who planted roses along the path, but as the one who chose, in the end, to speak. What lingered most weren't the facts. It was the feeling, the ache of a life lived in restraint, the nobility of restraint itself, and the cost of choosing truth in a world that often rewards the opposite. Hal Mercer had never told Nathan he was proud of him. But the silence between them had always felt like an invitation. And now, with the fragments pieced together, Nathan understood. He had been chosen, not for what he knew, but for what he might someday carry. And in the quiet hours of morning, when the park was still empty and the birds began their tentative songs, Nathan sometimes sat by the bench and whispered stories into the air. Not to mourn Hal, but to remind the world that he had lived. And that his memory was not in what he left behind, but in what he chose to carry alone, until he couldn't anymore. It began with the question that wouldn't rest. Who was he, really? The ceremony had passed, the flowers had wilted, and still Hal Mercer hovered like a shadow just out of reach. Nathan found himself circling the same park paths, watching the wind comb through the tall grass as if it might uncover some buried truth. The more he tried to hold on to Hal's memory, the more he realized how little he actually knew. Not just the facts, dates, locations, ranks, but the person. The boy before the soldier. The man behind the silence. So Nathan left. Not with a grand announcement or a dramatic farewell. Just a backpack, a journal, and the folder Hal had left behind. He took a bus out of town, then another, following faint trails like a detective of memory. The reporter had given him a list of names. A commanding officer from Hal's final deployment, a nurse who had treated him after the ambush, a man once court-martialed for defying orders in the same operation Hal had blown the whistle on. Most were hard to find. Some refused to talk. One wept the moment Hal's name was mentioned, then closed the door. But piece by piece, Nathan stitched together something more fragile and more human than a biography. There was a bar in New Mexico where Hal had once lived under a different name for nearly a year, tending bar and fixing the jukebox. A woman there, older now, said he spoke fluent Spanish and read Neruda during smoke breaks. She remembered him fixing her car's timing belt in the rain, unprompted. He looked like he was running, she said, but also like he was waiting for someone. There was a VA hospital in Colorado where Hal had volunteered on weekends, scrubbing floors and changing light bulbs, refusing pay. A janitor there remembered Hal as the guy who never asked questions but always knew when to listen. In an old storage unit outside of Tulsa, Nathan found a box left under Hal's real name. Inside were journals written in code, photographs of children in villages with their names written carefully on the backs, and a worn cassette tape labeled C Company Final Patrol. The tape was degraded, ghostly voices cutting in and out, but Nathan heard it. Hal's voice, low and clear, reading the names of the fallen. No commentary. Just names, like a mantra, like a promise never to forget. What struck Nathan most wasn't the enormity of Hal's past. It was the intimacy of it. The quiet consistencies. A man who saved seed packets. Who reused envelopes. Who left no debt unpaid. Who always left the last beer in the fridge for someone else. And slowly, something began to shift in Nathan. Not just the way he saw Hal, but the way he saw himself. He had left looking for a man. He found a mirror instead. A reflection not of who he was, but of who he could become if he had the courage to live deliberately. In Montana, at the edge of Glacier Park, Nathan met a former ranger who had once worked with Hal during fire season. He said Hal barely spoke, but when he did, it was to ask about the trees. What kind they were, how long they'd lived, whether they'd survive the next burn. The ranger paused before adding, "I think he understood fire better than most. And not just the kind that burns trees." Nathan asked why Hal had left. He said he had a promise to keep. That it was time to stop hiding. And in that moment, under a sky lit with stars that seemed impossibly far and achingly close, Nathan finally understood. Hal hadn't run away. He'd walked toward something. Redemption, perhaps. Or atonement. Or simply the quiet, unglamorous work of mending what he could, even if no one was watching. Especially if no one was watching. When Nathan returned home, he didn't speak much of the journey. There was no final revelation, no dramatic unveiling of secrets. Just a quiet knowing, a deeper breath, and a promise whispered into the elm tree's bark like a benediction. I found you. Not in medals or documents, but in stories, in scars, in seeds planted and left for others to water. And as Nathan resumed his walks through the park, he found he no longer searched the shadows for Hal. Because now, when he listened to the wind move through the grass, he didn't hear absence. He heard presence. Not loud, not obvious, but real. Like the echo of a man who had once believed he could never be found. And was, in the end, found by someone who knew how to look.